Every once in a while, you need to just have a really good rant about something that really doesn't matter, just to get it out of your system. And it's been a while since I've had a really good rant. So, here we go. I hate the term battle ready for a myriad of reasons, but the primary one is that it doesn't seem like anyone can agree on what that actually means. And what's worse about it is that, well, so many people use it as kind of like a buzzword, a catchphrase to sell you a product, and yet there is no real determination on what it means to be battle ready. And on top of all of that, it really just ends up being a checklist that if someone can meet the prerequisites for it, they can just call it battle ready. And what's even worse than that is that many times they don't even bother meeting those criteria that we all seem to have somehow agreed on, and then they sell you, well, a half-hearted product. At the end of the day, I don't really use that term. If you look at many of my videos, if I ever use the term battle ready, it's probably actually either a slip of the tongue or I'm using the phrase that was used by a manufacturer or seller of a product in a product description. And here's the reason for all of this. Because I don't think battle ready is a good indicator that something is worthy to be purchased. I think that you have to have criteria that are based on your purpose, and the weapon should be purpose-driven in its design and implementation. So I want to go through kind of the list of what people tend to think means battle ready, and then kind of dispel that and speak to what I think are the criteria you should look at in order for something to be worthy of a purchase as some sort of either functional weapon or a weapon-like instrument. So let's go through it. The first thing that people really want to focus on with battle ready is whether or not it's sharpened. I have a sword here that's an example of a sharpened sword. It's got kind of an obvious secondary bevel, and it can cut through things. Now this is a functional sword. I can use it as a weapon. I can use it as a sword. I could even maybe, if I was somehow magically transported back to the Middle Ages, use it in a battle. It's completely possible. Now this is an entry-level sword that kind of meets those criteria. But here's a sword that doesn't meet that criteria. It's blunt. It's not sharp. I couldn't take this into a medieval battle. Well, I guess I could, but it wouldn't do me much good. It's got a blunt tip, and yet this is a much better sword for its purpose than the one I just showed you. It has a distinct purpose-driven design. So is sharpness really something that makes it battle ready? Are we really expecting to get transported to the Middle Ages and have to fight a battle? I don't really know, and I don't like that term because there are people who would call that sword battle ready, even though it's not sharp. So the next thing that people look at is, well, whether or not it's made of proper materials. Now I have behind me, well behind me, a bunch of swords that we call sword-like objects or wall hangers. I have an entire display of swords that are based on the Lord of the Rings movies that are just replicas, and they're made out of stainless steel. They're not made of the right materials, and they would break. They're too brittle. What you want in a battle-ready sword is something that has the ability to flex, something that's made of a good high-quality, high-carbon steel, something that will kind of stand up to some abuse. And yet that in and of itself doesn't always make it battle ready, because just because it's made of the right materials, well, doesn't mean it's implemented properly. So then some people might say, well, what you also need, not just the right materials, but you need to have it to be properly tempered. That is, it's brought up to a critical heat, it's quenched to give it good hardness, and then it's heat treated back down to be flexible and not brittle, but still able to hold an edge and hold up to abuse. Well, that's great. I think that's a very important thing for a functional sword to have, and yet does that make it battle ready? And what's the proper tempering? And what's the proper material? See, I think these are all important things. When someone says battle ready, well, that's kind of a checklist. If we just make it out of this steel and we say that we heat treat it, that's good enough. But is the heat treating good enough? Is the hardness rating good enough? Is it too soft? Is it too hard? And some of this stuff is actually personal preference, or it's based on the type of sword, because a rapier isn't going to have necessarily the exact same heat treating as, say, a great sword. And you have to be able to differentiate these things. And are they battle ready in that case? Now, I would even go a step further in saying that something is battle ready or not, strictly just talking about whether or not it actually feels good in the hands, if it's actually something you can use. You see, something like a hammer has to feel a certain way, and you have to be able to swing it. If it's too heavy, well, it's not very effective because you get tired too easily. If it's too light, well, it's not very effective because there's not enough mass to drive a nail. The same thing is true of a sword. Here's an example of a sword that I wouldn't call battle ready. And this is a sword that has met all the criteria we've talked about thus far, and yet the handling of it just doesn't feel very good. The thickness of the hilt and the grip is way too much, and the whole balance and all this just doesn't feel very good. It's light for the type of sword it is, but would it be really effective in a cut? Would I be as effective with this sword as I would with one that was, well, slightly less built out than this one? I don't think so. I don't think these are things that make swords good. I think they're all important criteria, and yet I think it all misses the greater point. And I say all this because every website out there, every maker out there uses the term battle ready, and it drives me insane. And this came to a head when I did the unboxing of this sword. This is the special collector's edition sword that came with Kingdom Come Deliverance. I did an unboxing of it, and it's a sword that's super blunt, except for on the tip here. The tip is, well, it's super pointy. So that's kind of backwards. But for the most part, it's a well-made sword, or at least a sword-like object, but it's way too blunt. You couldn't use it. It wouldn't be battle ready. Well, maybe the tip would be, but the rest of it really isn't. And yet, it's all properly made. It's got good steel. It's got good flex. It seems to be properly heat treated. All the components fit real well. They're really sturdy. They're really strong. It feels good in the hand. And yet, it's not really battle ready. Okay, so you could call this a stage combat sword then, right? Well, no, it's got a really pointy tip. I wouldn't want to use this on a stage combat thing. If someone were to be using this on a stage, they are putting their theoretical opponent at risk. So it's not even really purposely driven to a design that's useful. Now, the design of this is, well, to be a collector's edition sword, to hang on a wall and for you to say, yeah, that's a properly made sword, even though it's not really sharp. So maybe it's meeting its design criteria. And some people have asked me, well, couldn't you just sharpen this and make it a battle-ready sword? Well, no, actually, I don't think you can. I will go through a list of reasons why right now. You see, the blade profile is such that if you were to try to sharpen this sword, you wouldn't really be meeting kind of the acute angle that you would need to have as a properly sharpened sword. The best you could do with the current blade thickness would be to maybe give it something more like the grind that you'd have on, say, a hatchet or an axe. And that's not really quite the same thing for a sword. To have a good cutting action, it's going to have to be more of a chopping action. That's not really what you want. It's not purpose-driven for a sword. Well, you could then maybe go back and regrind and redo the entire profile of the blade. The problem is the blade isn't quite thick enough for that. If you were to reprofile it, and it's not just thick, but it's width, it's not wide enough for that. If you were to reprofile it, you're going to take so much mass out of this blade that by the time you get to a point where it's profiled, that it can hold an edge, a good cutting edge, well, it's going to be such a light, flimsy sword that you're not really going to be able to do anything with it. This is a perfect example of a sword that in its current implementation can't really be saved for the purpose of being battle ready. So here's how I like to think of things. I don't want to think of things as being battle ready. I have never in my entire life at any point with any of the swords in my collection gone into a battle. I've never had to fight anyone. I've never had to try to kill anyone. I fully plan to never do any of that. I fully plan on living a very peaceable life and never using any one of these swords to inflict actual harm on someone. Now, I do use swords like this kind of like this, blunt practice swords to do historical European martial arts. And I fight against people who are properly padded, and we're all safe. We actually use things called faders, but this is kind of a good stand-in for a longsword, and it's more or less safe enough, more or less, and it's a good sword for its purpose. It's actually a really wonderful sword for its very distinct purpose. Certainly not for tournaments. I have a whole video on that. But at the end of the day, I think this is a battle-ready sword for battle-ready, again, for the purposes of HEMA. It's good for the purposes of practice. This one isn't. It's too sharp. It's got a nice point. I would kill someone. I don't want to use this in HEMA. I can use it for cut tests. It's purpose-driven to some extent to be functional for the purposes. I guess you could try to kill someone, but it's really functional for the purposes of a practitioner like myself to go cut things and use it like an actual sword to be used against, targets that aren't actually humans. At the end of the day, when I look at a sword, I look for very key things that tend to be on that laundry list of what people call battle ready. And I'm going to kind of break it down here because I've talked about a lot of them, but there's a few that I haven't talked about. One is the tang, the width of the tang. The tang is the part of the sword that comes off the blade. It's all usually one piece. The blade comes down to a shoulder, and then there is what's called a tang, which is a fairly thick piece of metal that goes all the way through the handle, through the pommel, and out the other end. And usually that's peened down. It's beaten down. You can actually see an example of it really well, actually, right here on this sword, because you got this huge peen right there. And that's compressing all the components to keep the sword together. And I think that's a very important feature to have, because if you don't have that and it's not properly implemented, it will break. I have videos on that as well. I do think the materials and the tempering are all important. I think if you want a sword that you can cut with, it needs to be able to hold an edge, and it needs to have an edge on it, either added by the manufacturer or by yourself after the fact. But that means the blade profile has to be proper for you to be able to do exactly that. So when I'm looking at swords, I'm not looking at swords to say, I want the sharp sword all the time. Maybe I want a stage combat sword. Maybe I want a sword that I can use safely against a person for the purposes of demonstration if they're not wearing all the padding. Maybe I want a sword that I can use against an opponent in a HEMA setting with all their padding in a tournament. Maybe I want a sword that I can use for the purposes of cutting with one hand. Maybe I want to have a sword that I can use for the purposes of cutting with two hands. Maybe I want a sword that has no other purpose than to be more or less properly built and to hang on a wall. See, at the end of the day, battle ready isn't a good term. It's actually a really bad term. What I call battle ready, what I mean by it, is completely divorced from what someone who maybe does something like Battle of Nations would call their battle ready sword. Someone who does HEMA all the time never uses a sharp sword. Their idea of a battle ready sword is a blunt sword, but one that isn't overbuilt for something like Battle of Nations. Maybe there are people who are only practitioners of just cutting, and they just want really nice swords that have a good cutting edge. Maybe there's just a collector who has no interest in any of this. They just want to make sure it's made of the proper materials. It almost doesn't matter if it's even tempered properly or if it can hold an edge. When you're looking at swords online, when you're looking at things that you want to purchase, when you're going to storefronts, whatever, ask the questions about what they're made out of, what type of steel, what's their tempering process. Be informed on these things. Understand what they are. It's hard to research things like steel, but if you know what the common ones are out there, then you can be better informed about what's being used to make these weapons. And if you're more informed there, you don't have to then look for the battle ready phrase, because that's honestly poisoned at this point. If you look at swords that claim to be battle ready and yet they seem to break all the time from a certain manufacturer, or they claim to be battle ready and they're made of the right materials, they're made of the right tempering process, they are made to be sharpened and they are sharpened, and yet the tang is not big enough to actually withstand some sort of impact, what's the point? If it's all put together and they decide to use a screw pommel on it, well, great. That can be fine, especially if it's a nut assembly. Those are wonderful. But sometimes they have their downsides, and then all the components might get loose. And is that really battle ready? You have to know what your purpose is. And that's the end of this rant, really. It's just Know what your purpose is. Know why you're buying a weapon. I say this all the time because honestly, I get attacked a lot in my video comment sections in YouTube being what they are. People always say, you spent $500 for a sword that can't even be sharpened. Why bother? Well, because it's a special collector's edition. If I really wanted a sharpened version of this sword, I more or less have one. I have like 12 of them. I don't really need another one. I wanted the one that came with the video game because I'm excited for a video game. If I want a sword that I can buy for $200 that is representative of a certain oak shot typology, I'd rather spend the $200 on that than try to never buy it and save up for one Albion that represents an oak shot typology that I already have represented in my collection. It's kind of true. I'd really want another Albion, but in all honesty, I want to have representation in my collection. And yet people don't seem to quite understand that. And that's fine, to each their own, but look for what you want, understand what you're getting, and then make a good purchase and quit using the term battle ready. Let's just ignore that term from now on. Let's only use it in the context of what it is, a poison term used as a buzzword by manufacturers and sellers to try to get you to give up some of your hard-earned cash for one of their products. Look for good, well-made swords, and then enjoy them for the purpose that you've purchased it for. That's it. Quite simple. Rant over.